On PBS. No, it's too much for him. And New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Washington D.C. had ran in, but there are cities that still won't run it. It doesn't have to do with the dirty words so much. It has to do with the fact that his dominant themes were the sexes, the races, religions, and the law. And the religion still remains, really a touchstone with people who think he's irreligious, when the truth is Lenny Bruce was one of the most moral and, in a way, religious, small R people I ever knew. He was an extremely moral person. And in fact, that's what Thank You, Masked Man really was all about. I mean, a lot of his things evolved from what I would call what-ifs. And the what-if in this case, before he'd ever thought about Thank You, Masked Man, was, what if there's no more evil in the world? And then he thought about it, he said, I know, I'd be in the unemployment line behind J. Edgar Hoover. And then he added, he did it another time in Jimmy Hoffa and J. Edgar Hoover. And then he added the Lone Ranger. And basically, what he was saying is, yeah, people that are good or pretend to be good, like me, meaning Lenny Bruce,
okay, right,
can wind up causing real problems, And the more he thought about it, he got into this very interesting thing of what if there was no more evil in the world, and I'd be in trouble. I couldn't make a living. I'd cause problems. And the idea of the Lone Ranger being, here's somebody who is better than Christ, better than Moses, the Lone Ranger. He doesn't even wait for thank yous. He just does his thing, and that. But what if they don't let him do his thing anymore? And well, he'd cause problems. And Lenny did. Lenny was a real genius, and on stage he did well, what we call Thank You, Masked Man, what he called the Lone Ranger, many times. And Fantasy Records has a version out where the Masked Man is like Shylock, Jewish. He's a Jewish loan shark.
Oh, no kidding.
And
I have to get that.
yeah, it came out after his death. And when Thank You, Masked Man, the film became popular, Ralph Gleason, who was a good friend of mine and who was involved with Fantasy Records, put out this thing, and it has a version that's quite different. Well, different in a way. And Lenny was like that. Lenny was a real. He changed things from version to version. However, for people think I got this off a record. No, he did it 8, 9 times for this. He never lived to see the animated short because we didn't. Animation takes time to do.
Sure.
And I recorded him in '65, and he died in '66, and it wasn't until '68 or '69. It wasn't until '68 that I finished it, and we had it out in '69. So, but and I'm sorry he didn't live to see it, because he would have found out that animation is really his métier, or would have been his métier. His kind of mind would have been perfect for it.
Hang on a second. Mike?
Yeah, sure.
For lack thereof. Well, how did you get? How did I get involved with it?
Well, I had an animation film company that did animation, among other things, back in the early '60s, and he was playing one night, 1963, it may have been '62, on a place called the Off-Broadway, which no longer exists.
I think I remember that.
And I stopped by, and
that was in San Francisco?
Yeah, in San Francisco. And my film company was just a half a block away. And I stopped by, I was late. I missed my ride. And I went up, and bear in mind, Lenny Bruce was not a big name then. He was not. He was like, he was sort of a small item on page 6 or 7 saying, sick comic, arrested for language or dope or whatever. And he wasn't a big name, and when I went to see him, he just knocked me out. Now, there were no comedy clubs in those days, there were nightclubs, and he was just at Off-Broadway was just a nightclub, and he was playing there to maybe half an audience, mostly salesmen and travelers, and he just knocked me out. I mean, because the guy was into an area, I was familiar with his records, but he was into an area that was really great, and that was he was thinking about life and thinking about the sexes, the religions, the races, and so he and I became fast friends. And then when I realized that he was going broke because he could only play, at this time he'd been arrested 3 times for obscenity in 3 different major cities, and had been found not guilty only in San Francisco, that's why he could be played at San Francisco, is that at this time the New York obscenity bust was going to, in all probability, send him to jail. Not for that long, 6 months or whatever, on obscenity, but when he got out, he'd still be faced with this same problem of not being able to get a cabaret card. And if you can't get a cabaret card in a major city like New York, you have problems in making a living. And he had gotten to the point now where he was not going to compromise what he was doing for that. That just seemed pointless to him, and of course it would. It's like asking an artist to, look, don't paint this way, do it this way, you know?
Sure, yeah.
And so I decided, his trial, I looked over some of the transcripts, and he was talking about him in his case was just such a travesty of justice that I said, look, if we do a film with no edits, so this is a Thank You Man, this is a performance film, not Thank You Man. If we do a film with no edits, that's just you and that, we might be able to get it shown in court. If not, we certainly would have critics who would say that this was your version of it. But to do that, you got to let me audio tape you for 30 hours, and you got to listen to 15 hours of it. And the reason for that was he would do these versions on stage of what he was arrested for because people were interested in it. However, one time it would be these facts, one time it would be these facts, and you know, Lenny was dead set on making whatever he said not only true but funny, and sort of lost when you get into a court of law. You know, you've got to make sure that you got to be very specific about what you're saying. You know, I was arrested saying this. You can be funny. So I figured I've got to listen to all these tapes, and I had him cross-index the things he were taught, not to memorize, but because he, you know, he was like a jazz musician, but so that he would hit all the right notes as far as the facts go. Okay. And even then, on the last, before we did the final filming, and we did only film once, I did some lighting tests of him, but I already taped all this stuff, and he listened to half of it, and it really helped. But even then, he had to have a summary transcript of the thing in his hand, so that if he got lost, he would, he could say, okay, this is what they said I was arrested for. The film is like an historical document, you know, but, okay, in the course of doing that, as I said, I had an animation company, and the director of animation, a guy named Jeffrey Hale, was a a really good guy, and so I told Lenny I wanted to film, you know, Thank You Masked Man, and I said, I want you to do it several times for me. We only did it once without an audience, and that was the unusable one, because the audience is part of his act, you know. I mean, just it isn't so much the laughter as it is, there was just something dead about doing it in the studio that was not true the other times. So the Thank You Masked Man is an intermix of about 8 different versions of...
So when he was on stage, he would do all the different voices?
Oh yeah.
Did he?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
But without the characters, I mean, you just have to visualize it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he didn't. He had no. As a matter of fact, we had to take out some of the descriptive lines that he'd do, and he'd add some things that we took out for the Thank You Masked Man version because it wasn't needed. But you know, as a guy, he wasn't thinking I'm going to do this for film. You know, even when he was doing it for film, he was. You know, if a person like Lenny, unless he's doing it, if say we had done a pencil test first and run that, and then he did into the characters sort of thing, that would have been one way to do it. I believe Robin Williams did that for the movie he did for Disney. I forgot Arabian Nights, or was it Arabian Nights or Aladdin? I guess
Yeah.
Okay, but that's sort of doing it. I'm not sure whether he did it that way or not, but that's one way to do it. And but in this case, Lenny was just, okay, he says he's going to animate it someday, fine,
Yeah, right.
but he wasn't doing it.
Huh. Well, we're sitting here in the Voodoo Lounge in San Francisco in 2001.
Yeah, right.
And you're saying that in some cities they still won't.
Well, okay, I better amend that. In the late 80s, PBS wanted to run the performance film in their major cities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I've forgotten how it works. So they signed up a certain number of cities, and they gave me a certain amount of money, and I got Dustin Hoffman to put a prologue on the film.
Okay.
Gratis. I mean, he got just Screen Actors Guild base for it. However, not all cities would run it, and to this day, Los Angeles has never run it. I don't think Chicago has. I'm not sure. But it's funny. The reason they say they will not run it, it has to do with the fact. Well, our audiences aren't that interested in it. Yeah, well, that's that's a fraud.
Right. Yeah. You see worse than that on soaps.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And because late at night, what do the words matter now?
Yeah.
But
well, just to kind of go on to that theme. If Lenny were to walk in the door today, in today's society, what would you say to him?
Well, first of all, Lenny was a very nice person, and he walked the streets over in when he was in town, which was quite often, over in North Beach, and he'd be hi, this and that. But he was a very observant guy, and very, very. He had no need to be funny one-on-one, like this and that. And he was not a performer in that sense of always on. But he was a great observer, and whatever caught his eye or his ear and all that, invariably what separated him from the rest of us was not just the things that are wrong, but certain things about it that could make it right or could make it, outrageously wrong or this and that. And trying to think of an example of how. Well, one of the first things he did long before I met him was when he was playing strip clubs down in L.A. and the Catholic Church were having bingo or something like that, and he talked about auctioning off one of the churches. It was that sort of thing. And
that upset him.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And he just had an ear and an eye for doing, turning something to the nth degree.
Okay.
And,
Well,
and he'd be doing that today if he were. I have no idea what he'd be into, but I know that it would be something like that.
Yeah, that's hard to visualize in San Francisco. How could you take it further?
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess it could be done.
Oh, sure, sure.
It would probably upset people.
Oh, yeah. Well, the racial things. I mean, the problems are still there. My grandsons just got back from Cuba. Now they're 18 and 16, and aside from the fact that it's a one-man dictatorship, they were shocked to find that it's a classless society over there, and racially, you don't realize how intolerant even places like this are compared to, say a place like Cuba, even though it's a dictatorship, And also what they realize is how bad our medical system is compared to theirs, where they have a hospital way station every 2 blocks or so, And I guess what I'm getting at is the fact that things are not, they're not that great here. I mean, they're better in different ways and this and that, but I mean, our medical system isn't that great. Our educational system isn't that great.
That's true.
It's not very open, and in some ways it's more closed than it ever was. And in some ways, I mean, I have grandsons that are half black, and in some ways, and so I'm aware of what my children or not, and that is things are strangely still what they were, you know, a few years ago.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
And Lenny would be into that. I mean, he would be into that in a big way, and the same with sexual things, you know. I mean, anyway.
Yeah. Well, you know. Yeah. You know, same. A lot of what Lenny was doing. I mean, he would talk about homosexuals and
sure.
You know, you put men in prison with a lot of other men.
Right. Well.
You know.
Right.
And that still goes on. And,
right.
And I guess in San Francisco, it's certainly tolerated, or maybe even encouraged.
Well, it's tolerated, but they live in one section of the section of the city, you know.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that they're not. There's an area that they tolerate us in a strange way. They meaning they're not as comfortable, you know, with heterosexuals and vice versa. You know, I mean, there's a and he would be into that and you know. Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and of course, then there's the drug use. You know, that hasn't.
Yeah, and okay, that's a good point. When you take drugs now, the time I knew him, you know, he'd been busted as a junkie and this and that, and his wife, whom he had divorced by the time I knew him, but I got to know her afterwards, honey. She was a big drug user at one time, but she also was drug-free in the 80s when I knew her, and member of AA, and as I am, and he never used drugs to my knowledge when we were because a lot of performers I know, improvisers and that, are on speed, were on speed then. And Lenny never gave any indication of that at all. And as far as other drugs go, I never saw him use anything. And however, he died of an overdose, but it's still not clear. Some people say it was an overdose of morphine. Ralph Gleason, who was who helped start Rolling Stone and was the jazz critic at the time, and a friend of mine said no, the police first reported it was an overdose of heroin. He said no, it was an overdose of morphine, which he had a legitimate use for because he was in the hospital for falling out a window here, and he was just getting over that. So I don't know to this day whether or not it was whether it was a. Some of his friends claim no, it was a drug he got on the streets and it was just too pure and he took too much of it. Well, whatever happened, I know it was an accident. It wasn't intentional, and I'm sure of that, because this guy was a genius. He knew it. He was very interested in life, and he had every reason to want to live. And,
well, I guess it's pretty tough to speculate what he'd be doing today.
Well, if he'd be doing satire of some kind, and what form it would take in that, I don't know, because he wasn't really interested in the business of it. He was certainly interested in making money and having it and having his act seen in that. And I think some of his best things were when he performed at Carnegie Hall, and he performed at a theater here, and he was at his best in unusually. He did a performance here at the Curran Theater, and it was a rainy night, and so there was all this drama about getting the theater and this and that. It was one of his best performances, and then same with Carnegie Hall, and it was so. So I think if he were around, he'd probably be doing if he were doing stand-up, really. I don't know that he would be. If he had lived, I think he had definitely been doing animation. Because I think he could see how his stuff was. He was born for it, even more than Robin Williams, maybe.
That's an interesting comparison with him and Robin Williams, because Robin Williams is a little bit out there.
Oh yeah, he's definitely out there, and he's I saw him a few weeks ago getting together a new act over at, and he was trying out with a friend. He was trying it out with Mike Dugan, who's a friend of mine who was appearing, Robin would come in and do his act afterwards, anonymously. I mean, he wasn't, and he, as he does, he will appear occasionally at comedy clubs here. He's trying to do stuff, but they're different people. I mean, Robin Williams is quite a different person from Lenny Bruce, but obviously very talented and does voices very well.
Yeah, I've been a Masked Man fan for 30 years or however long it is, and I didn't realize until I don't know 10 years ago that Lenny Bruce had done all the voices.
Yeah.
I mean, they're when you know that, you can see the similarities, but they're really quite different.
Well, bear in mind now, we did overdub a little bit. There's a place where we had to. I took a thing from the day on Christians and Jews to make a scene change and stuff like that. So when I say he did all the voices, but they are edited, a little bit too.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But have you ever heard of a person, Bill Hicks, a guy named Bill Hicks?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, if you want me to digress without...
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, the only person, and bear in mind, I did work with Richard Pryor, and some years afterwards, he did some stuff for me for the Electric Company, which is a Sesame Street thing.
Right.
And brilliant guy in that. But the only guy that has ever reminded me of Lenny Bruce was a young man named Bill Hicks. And Bill Hicks reminded me a lot of him. And he was a young man who died of cancer of the pancreas at the age of 31 in 1994. And I saw Bill Hicks just once perform, and he just knocked me out. And he couldn't do the voices that Lenny could do, but his sense of morality and all this was way out there. Totally different kind of person. His parents were Southern Baptists from Arkansas, and his background, he grew up in Austin, Texas, but he was so much like Lenny Bruce, and I was going to film him at the Punchline in February of '94, late January '94, and he died. In '93, and he died in '94, and of cancer of the pancreas, which is not a young man's problem usually. Yeah. But what it was, I guess the reason I'm bringing it up as far as Lenny Bruce goes, now it was almost 30 years to the day, to the month when I ran into Bill Hicks. But those two kind of guys don't come along very often.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from the Robin Williams, but I'm talking about the guys who are dangerous.
Okay.
And who wind up. The month I got to know Bill Hicks, there was a profile on him by John Lahr in the New Yorker a month later. I didn't know about that, but he was just becoming well known with it. And he was going to appear on Letterman, which he'd been on 17 times before, but Letterman had been moved a half hour earlier. So it was a little close, and he got bumped off, censored off by CBS. I mean, he did the show, but it never appeared. And,
oh, really?
And it didn't appear because he was into things about gays and about other things. So it was like Lenny Bruce all over again. It was just
and
like
30 years later.
30 years later, and Bill, his mom and dad, who are Baptist fundamentalists, I still am in contact with in Arkansas. I've never met them personally, but I know them over the phone. And they had to get used to a son who was way out there, way out there, and they did. I mean, but when you say Lenny Bruce, if he'd been around, what if Lenny Bruce and Bill Hicks been around? Jesus, I don't know. This country. Well, this type of person needs to be really. I mean, I'm glad you're doing this, and I'm glad they are so rare. But boy, does a country need guys like this. They really do. Because Hicks, just like Bruce, couldn't care less. Well, he could care that he was about the reasons he was, censored off of, just cut out of, on Letterman. And here Letterman is a far-out person, and a really good person. But, his producer said, well, there's some hot points here that we better just eliminate it. Well, that's always going to be true. They're always going to, but we really need people that won't bother. And but they have to be geniuses. I mean, otherwise it's just, you know.
Well, yeah, they have to make that jump into the performance.
Yeah, it's just being angry isn't enough, you know.
No, we got plenty of them.
Right, right. And you can rant like Dennis Miller or somebody like that, but it's quite a different thing to actually make art out of it, you know. And so,
Yeah.
And anyway.
So I guess you and Lenny were personal friends.
Oh yeah,
besides
yeah.
professional.
Well, yes, but bear in mind he had two lives. He lived in L.A. I mean, he was he was a New York kid who came to Los Angeles, and his roots were down there, and my roots have always been San Francisco. So Lenny basically, after his death, there was a guy who was doing a biography, Bob Whitey, who was doing to swear to tell the truth, and I realized afterwards that at the time of his death, okay, I'll tell you what, is I couldn't understand why the movie Lenny was the way it was. It had him sort of a tragic victim and a kind of a mama's boy, which he wasn't, or, you know, mama's boy who was really upset at all this stuff that was happening. Lenny wasn't that way at all with me, and he wasn't in town because he was here performing. But apparently what happened is he'd go home and whine to his friends, you know, which is a natural thing.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, geez, I'm gonna get all these problems and this and that. So, and when I filmed Dustin Hoffman, which a prologue, he asked me what I thought of the film Lenny, and I said it was a really good film, if you want my opinion, but it wasn't the Lenny Bruce I knew. And he said, why? And I said, well, you know, that at the end, when you were doing a lot of whining, that isn't what he was doing. I just never saw that. Well, I didn't realize until this guy Whitey made this movie for HBO called Swear to Tell the Truth, that he had some of his comedian buddies, you know, not big names, but guys around there, and they were saying, oh yeah, life was really tragic at the end. He hated this. Well, I never saw that because he was working up here, you know, and hanging out with me, but he wasn't whining, you know, and then he'd go home and feel lousy. So that's